4 years ago, I accidentally found a book. It was in a library full of old books. Curiously, I picked one of them up, opened it, and there it was. A dedication. Soon I discovered that almost all these books had names in them or dedications. But in this film, I will tell you only about this one book that I picked up first. The book is the prayer book of a liberal Jewish community in Munich, Israelitische Kultusgemeinde München. The dedication reads, Paul Max Hechinger, in memory of his Bar Mitzwah on the 13th of March in 1937, Board of the Israelite Religious Community in Munich, Dr. Österreich. Without this book, nobody today would know something about Paul Max. He did not have any brothers or sisters or children. The only thing that is left of him is his name in a book. 4 years ago, I tried to find out something about Paul Max. Who was he? What I found out at the time was this. The day of his Bar Mitzvah was the 1st of Nisan according to the Jewish calendar. It was Shabbat Vayikra, so the Torah portion was the beginning of the 3rd book of the Torah, the book of Leviticus. It was Shabbat HaChodesh. On this Shabbat, there was a youth service in his synagogue, as an old calendar of the main synagogue in Munich shows. Did Paul have his Bar Mitzvah within this youth service? At the end of the service, a member of the board would have come up to the bima and give him the prayer book of the community as a Bar Mitzvah present, probably with the usual wish that he may use this book very often from now on. But in the case of Paul, his synagogue was demolished about a year after his Bar Mitzvah in June 1938. The memorial book Victims of the Persecution of Jews in Germany says about Paul Max, Deportation, unknown place of deportation. So it looks as if the Nazis caught Paul, but he didn't get anywhere. But how come his prayer book ended up in Lisbon? We find the name Paul Max Israel Hechinger on a passenger list of a ship. A ship from Lisbon to New York. The SS Muizinho. According to this list, Paul got a visa for the United States on the 9th of June 1941, 4 years after his Bar Mitzvah. But how did Paul get from Munich to Lisbon? Was he one of the millions of Germans who tried to flee out of Europe between 1939 and 1944? The flight path was across France, Spain, Portugal to Lisbon, the only open harbour during the war. Was Paul one of those who crossed the border between France and Spain in the Pyrenees Mountains secretly by night? Afterwards, many took a train through Spain, which brought them to Rossio station in Lisbon. Here they all waited for ships. On August 20th, 1941, Paul entered the SS Muizinho in Lisbon Harbour. It was a ship that brought refugee children to the United States. The person who paid for Max's journey was the Hamburg banker Erich Warburg, says the passenger list. A friend of the family, says the list. Paul was 17 at the time. He travelled alone, without friend, brother or sister. The entry says he wouldn't know anybody in the US at all. And money he also didn't have with him. Actually, the SS Muizinho brought children up to the age of 16 to the US. Paul was 17. But there is a remark, he was a cook apprentice. So was he a cook on this ship? The journey on the sea took 13 days, so almost 2 weeks. On September 2nd, 1941, Paul arrived in New York. Probably he first came to Ellis Island Immigration and Detention Center. 4 years ago, that was all I could find out about Paul. In the US, it looked as if his trail was lost. But in the meantime, there's much more data in the internet. I also could get information from the Munich archives. And suddenly I know much more about Paul's life before and after Lisbon. About that I would like to tell you in this film. I discovered things about his family that grant us insights into Paul's life in Munich before he came as a refugee to Lisbon and left his book there. His parents were Julius and Rosa Hechinger. They got married on March 29th in 1923 in Munich. Rose was 24 at the time and Julius 28. Julius had a doctorate in law and had fought for Germany in World War I as corporal. About Rosa, I tell you later. Paul's grandmother, the mother of his father, Gertraud Hechinger, was 53 years old at the wedding of her son. She originally was from Fürth, a famous Jewish center since medieval times. It was even called the Bavarian Jerusalem. His paternal grandfather, Felix, was already 75 at the time of the wedding. He was 22 years older than his wife. Paul's parents lived in the apartment of the paternal grandparents in Hans-Sachs-Straße 14, 4th floor in Munich. It is here that a year after their wedding, Paul is born on March 3rd, 1924. He will remain their only child. Probably he is called Paul after the brother of his mother who died in Munich 4 months before his birth on November 3rd, 1923 at the age of only 15. It is a custom among Ashkenazi Jews to name their children after a deceased relative. And he is called Max, a name nobody in his family had before, but Maximilian is the name of many Bavarian dukes and kings. Maybe the name Max shows how Bavarian the family was, who knows. When Paul is 8, his grandfather dies at the age of 84 in Munich on June 12, 1932. A year later, 4 weeks after Paul's 9th birthday, on March 30th, 1933, his father got arrested and spent 1 day in prison. His crime, according to the documents, was being Jewish. Paul's parents were active members in their local synagogue. In 1935, his father became a member of the community board of the Israelitische Kultusgemeinde Munich, a German liberal synagogue. The rabbi of his synagogue was Rabbi Dr. Leo Berwald, a Munich-born scholar who had his PhD in philosophy from the University of Erlangen and his smicha, his rabbinical ordination, from the Breslau Seminary. Paul's father also was treasurer of the Jewish Gymnastics and Sports Club in Munich. Did Paul also take part there? Did he like sports? On March 3rd, 1937, Paul celebrates his 13th birthday, and the only child of the family celebrates his Bar Mitzwah on March 13th, on Shabbat HaChodesh. His Bar Mitzvah portion is Vayikra. Did he chant the Maftir in the service? Leviticus 5 verses 24 to 26? What did he say to these chapters from the third book of the Torah? He probably chanted the Haftarah of Shabbat HaChodesh from Ezekiel 45 and 46. Candy will have been thrown at him. Mazal Tov, the people will have chanted and shouted. And then somebody from the board came up to him and gave him the present from the community, the prayer book of the synagogue, Seder Tefillot, and on the first page, written in beautiful handwriting, in memory of his Bar Mitzvah. Without this book, today nobody would know about Paul, because this book is what is left from him. It bears his name and made me ask, who was Paul? 1937 also was a special year for the Munich community as a whole. They celebrated the 50th anniversary of their synagogue building. 15 months after his Bar Mitzvah, Paul's synagogue was demolished in June 1938. It was the first synagogue in Germany that got destroyed. It was torn down by personal order from Adolf Hitler. The congregation held a last service in the building filled with emotions of loss and sadness. Paul's father, Julius Hechinger, became responsible for the finances of the congregation and responsible for creating new community rooms in Lindwurmstraße 125. Here the congregation now met after the demolition of the synagogue in a former tobacco factory. The former machine room of the factory was transformed into a hall for 500 people. But only 5 months later, this hall was demolished in Kristallnacht. The furniture and the library got destroyed and the room needed to be renovated. On December 14th, 1938, the new room, in an artificially simple, dignified form, astonished all visitors. Paul experienced this time as a post-Bar Mitzvah, his father being actively involved in congregational work. Paul went 4 years to high school, to Munich Realgymnasium, and then stopped going there and started a training as a confectioner and cook. Did he attend Albert Schwartz's cooking school? Since 1938, this was an institution of his congregation. The former Jewish restaurant had now turned into a cooking school. 3 years after his Bar Mitzvah, Paul's mother died. That is, she was murdered. And this is why and how. Paul's uncle Isidor, the eldest brother of his mother, lived since 1917 in the mental home Egelfing Haar in the east of Munich. Was this a consequence of World War I, or was there a tendency to mental illnesses in the family? The entry in the city archive of Munich says Rosa Hechinger, Paul's mother, suffered from schizophrenia. She too lived in Egelfing Haar. Did it start after giving birth? Was she sterilized in the mental home as it was done in those days? And did Paul therefore not have any brother or sister? On September 20th, 1940, as part of the so-called T4 action, she was brought to Schloss Hartheim near Linz in Austria. On the very day of her arrival, she was gassed with carbon monoxide. She was 40 years old. Paul was 16 at the time. The killing of the mentally ill and handicapped was the beginning of the gasification of millions of people. A year after the murder of his mother, in June 1941, Paul receives visa for the United States. Besides, his rabbi is already there. Rabbi Leo Berwald emigrated in 1940 via London, UK, to the US and became rabbi of Congregation Beth Hillel in Washington Heights, a congregation founded by German immigrants, mainly from Munich and Nuremberg. Rabbi Leo Berwald served there till 1955 and he died in April 1970 in New York. But let's go back to his former Bar Mitzvah in Munich. So in June 1941 he gets a visa. 3 months later he enters the ship in Lisbon, the ship to New York, on which he was a cook apprentice. Why did he leave his prayer book in Lisbon? At least it shows that he had some contact to the refugee congregation there that was founded in 1934 by Polish and German Jews. Before I tell you what happened to Paul in the United States, let me tell you what happened to his father in Munich after Paul left. In 1941, Paul's father, Julius Hechinger, becomes a member of the Council of the Israelite Religious Congregation in Munich. He got the order to put together the lists with the names of those who would be evacuated, that is, who would be deported to Terezin or other places. He worked with the Nazis. Why? Did he think he could improve the situation? Or was he afraid? Didn't he leave Germany because his now elderly mother was still with him? On March 7th, 1942, Paul just celebrated his 18th birthday. Is the address of his father the hospital of the Israelite religious congregation? Why is his address the hospital? End of March, so I learned in a research about the destinies of Jews in Munich, Paul's father got the information that he himself got onto a list of those to be deported. It was planned for April 4th to go to Piaski in the east. Paul's father flees. The circumstances of the flight are mysterious, and eyewitnesses remember contradictory things. Obviously, he learned on the phone that he was on the deportation list himself while he was in the synagogue rooms in Lindwurmstraße 125. He asked somebody for a bike and disappears. But the flight failed. A few days later he got caught and was taken to the barrack camp Knorrstraße 148 in Milbertshofen. There he was severely tortured and humiliated. An eyewitness, who was 10 years old at the time, remembers. So the Gestapo came at night to drive Julius Hechinger, who helped put the transports together, with the water hose through the warhouse. Another time he had to clean the latrine with his bare hands. Sometimes the Gestapo drove him and other Jews through the camp until everyone collapsed with exhaustion. On July 13th, 1942, Paul's father is on the list of 50 persons from Munich who were about to be transported to Auschwitz. It is possible that he arrived there 2 days later on July 15th, as this was the day when his fortune was transferred to the German Reich. Was he gassed on the very day of his arrival in Auschwitz, or later? So Paul's father, Dr. Julius Hechinger, dies, probably in Auschwitz, at the age of 46. Contemporaries remember, Hechinger was a man of great energy and breadth of vision. He was adept at approaching the authorities tactfully, cautiously, and yet resolutely in dealing with the difficult and sensitive matters trusted to him. He had great empathy with the persons persecuted for political reasons, was inventive in finding the means to assist them, and did not shrink back from any danger. On a personal level, he was not easygoing. Ambition and a certain recklessness brought him into conflicts with the heads of other departments and even with the rabbinate. Arrogant and domineering, he was the best hated man in the community. Did Paul in the US ever learn about what happened to his father left in Germany? It is very likely that he never got to know it till the end of his life. Paul's father, Dr. Julius Hechinger, died in Auschwitz at the age of 46. And Paul in New York? He too will not reach old age. He will die only 2 years after his father, probably killed by Germans. Why? In the US, Paul takes a new name. He is now Paul M. Harris. He joins the US Army and helps to fight fascism in Europe. He got promoted to the military rank Private First Class. Private Paul M. Harris was killed in action on February 8, 1944 in Italy, a month before his 20th birthday. His grave is in some American military cemetery south of Rome. He left behind a prayer book in Lisbon and a passport photo in the archives in Munich. Paul M. Harris formerly Paul Max Hechinger, the memory of his Bar Mitzwah is a family history of the 20th century.
שוכן במרומים אמצעי מנוחה נכונה תחת כנפי השכינה במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזורקי המסירים את נשמות הנחמדים שהלכו לעולמם מול רחמים הסתירים בסתר כנפיך לעולמים מצרור חיים את נשמתם אדוני הוא נחלתם וינוחו ושלום על משכבם.